Get out! My father's voice cut through the dining room like a blade, his colonel's authority making the crystal glasses tremble on our family table. This is a discussion for real military personnel. You wouldn't understand. The words landed like a physical blow, as 20 members of the Mitchell family turned to stare at me, the disappointment, the daughter who had somehow failed to carry on our proud military tradition. My brother, Mark, sat at the head of the table in his dress uniform, his new lieutenant colonel's oak leaves catching the chandelier light, accepting congratulations for his latest promotion, while I sat in civilian clothes like an outsider at my own family gathering. For 31 years, I had endured their subtle dismissals and not-so-subtle comparisons, the daughter who couldn't hack it in the military, who had settled for marrying a simple Navy captain instead of building her own career. But tonight, as my father's humiliating command hung in the air and I felt the familiar burn of family shame, my husband David slowly rose from his chair beside me. His voice was calm, respectful, but carried an undertone that made everyone pause. "Before Sarah leaves, Colonel Mitchell, I'd like to request permission to make a toast." The room fell silent as 20 pairs of eyes focused on the Navy SEAL captain who rarely spoke during family gatherings. "Just one toast," David continued, his hand finding mine under the table, "in honor of someone whose service has never been properly recognized." My father had no idea what he had just unleashed. The humiliation had been building for 31 years, but it reached its crescendo on a crisp October evening in our family's dining room in Norfolk, Virginia. The Mitchell family had gathered to celebrate my brother Mark's promotion to lieutenant colonel, and the mahogany table groaned under the weight of my mother's finest china and the expectations of military excellence that had defined our family for 3 generations. I sat at the far end of the table, wearing a simple navy dress that my mother had already criticized twice as too casual for such an important occasion. Around me, the Mitchell military dynasty held court in their dress uniforms. My father, Colonel Robert Mitchell, whose chest displayed ribbons from 3 decades of distinguished Army service; my Uncle James, a retired Marine Corps general, whose mere presence commanded respect; my cousins David and Michael, both majors in their respective branches, their uniforms pressed to knife-edge perfection. And then there was me, Sarah Mitchell Wells, the family disappointment who had somehow failed to carry on the proud military tradition that defined our bloodline. Mark presided over the gathering from his position at the head of the table, resplendent in his Army dress blue uniform with the brand-new oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel gleaming on his shoulders. At 33, he was everything our family had dreamed their golden son would become: Ranger qualified, airborne certified, with 2 combat deployments and a Bronze Star that our father mentioned in every conversation with family friends. "To think," my mother Margaret was saying, her voice bright with maternal pride, "Lieutenant Colonel Mark Mitchell, your grandfather would be so proud to see his legacy continuing." She raised her wineglass toward my brother, who accepted the toast with the practiced humility of someone accustomed to being the center of family celebrations. "Just doing my duty, Mom, serving my country and upholding the Mitchell family tradition." The phrase, Mitchell family tradition, was a weapon that had been used against me for decades. It referred to the unbroken line of military excellence that stretched back to my great-grandfather's service in World War II, through my grandfather's career as a Marine Corps officer, to my father's distinguished Army record, and now to Mark's rising star in the military hierarchy. I was the crack in that tradition, the daughter who had somehow failed to measure up despite every advantage and opportunity. "Sarah," my cousin Michael said, turning the conversation toward me with the kind of polite interest reserved for family members whose accomplishments were too modest to generate genuine enthusiasm. "How's David's career going? Still stationed at Little Creek?" The question was carefully phrased to focus on my husband's military service, rather than my own non-existent career. Captain David Wells was a Navy SEAL, a career that should have commanded respect from any military family. But the Mitchells had perfected the art of subtle dismissal, acknowledging David's service while simultaneously suggesting that I had contributed nothing beyond marrying well. "David's doing well," I said quietly, reciting the cover story I had perfected over 7 years of family gatherings. "He's been deployed quite a bit lately, training exercises mostly." "Training exercises," my father repeated, with the knowing nod of someone who understood military euphemisms. "SEALs stay busy. Good thing you're there to keep things running on the home front while he's serving his country." The implication was clear. While David served in an elite military unit, my role was domestic support. I was the military wife who held down the household while real warriors did the important work of national defense. "What about you, Sarah?" my Aunt Linda asked, with genuine curiosity. "Are you still doing that volunteer work at the base?" Volunteer work was how my family had categorized my absences over the past several years. When I disappeared for weeks at a time on what I claimed were consulting projects for military contractors, they assumed I was involved in the kind of charitable activities that kept military spouses busy while their husbands deployed. "I do some consulting work for defense contractors," I said, maintaining the carefully constructed fiction that had protected my operational security for 7 years. Defense contracting can be lucrative. A lot of former military personnel transition into that field after they retire. Good way to monetize military experience for people who couldn't quite make it to retirement in uniform. The phrase "couldn't quite make it" was delivered with surgical precision. It referenced my supposed military failure, the family narrative that I had washed out of officer candidate school after 6 months and never recovered from the disappointment of not measuring up to Mitchell family standards.
That narrative was a lie, but it was a lie that had served its purpose for 7 years. The truth was that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Phoenix Mitchell hadn't washed out of OCS. I had been recruited directly from the program by Joint Special Operations Command for classified operations that required someone with my specific skill set: fluent Arabic and Farsi, advanced psychological operations training, and the kind of analytical mind that could design complex strategic deceptions. My failure to complete officer candidate school had been carefully orchestrated theater designed to create a cover identity that would explain my subsequent absence from traditional military career progression. While my family celebrated Mark's conventional military achievements, I was building a career in the shadows that operated far beyond their understanding. For 7 years, I had been the commanding officer of Psychological Operations Task Force Phoenix, a joint military unit responsible for strategic deception operations in the Middle East and Central Asia. My work involved designing and implementing complex psychological warfare campaigns that had disrupted terrorist recruitment networks, prevented attacks on American interests, and gathered intelligence that saved countless lives. My handler was General Patricia Hayes, a woman who understood the cost of invisible service and who treated me with the kind of professional respect my family had never shown. I remembered a conversation with her just 6 months earlier, after I had successfully concluded Operation Desert Mirror, a complex deception campaign that had turned a terrorist cell against itself. "Phoenix," she said over our encrypted connection, using the call sign that had become more real to me than my birth name, "the intelligence gathered from Desert Mirror has prevented at least 3 major attacks on U.S. interests. The Secretary of Defense specifically mentioned your work in his briefing to the President." I was sitting in a safe house in Dubai, exhausted from 3 months of deep cover operations that had required me to pose as a wealthy American entrepreneur with ties to international shipping networks. My family thought I was in Virginia, managing a consulting contract for a defense contractor. "Any word on the promotion board?" I asked. "Confirmed. You're being promoted to full colonel effective immediately. At 31, you'll be the youngest woman in U.S. military history to achieve that rank in special operations." The promotion was classified at levels that prohibited any public acknowledgement. While my brother celebrated his advancement to lieutenant colonel with family dinners and newspaper announcements, my promotion to full colonel would be noted only in classified personnel files that fewer than 50 people had clearance to access. "Congratulations, Phoenix. Your psychological operations have reshaped how we approach strategic deception. The methodologies you developed are being implemented across all combatant commands." That conversation had taken place 4 months before I sat in my parents' dining room, listening to my family celebrate Mark's conventional military career while treating me like a failed appendage to my husband's service. The dinner conversation continued around me, with family members sharing stories about military service, deployment experiences, and the challenges of maintaining family traditions across generations. I listened with a detached interest of someone observing a foreign culture, marveling at how they could discuss military excellence while remaining completely ignorant of the actual wars being fought in shadows. The thing about today's military, my Uncle James was saying, his Marine general's authority lending weight to his observations, is that it requires a different kind of commitment than previous generations. The operational tempo is higher, the training more demanding, the personal sacrifices more significant. He gestured toward Mark with obvious pride. What Mark has accomplished represents the kind of dedication that not everyone possesses. Military service isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in recognizing your limitations early. The phrase recognizing your limitations was aimed directly at me, a reminder that I had supposedly discovered my own inadequacy during officer candidate school and wisely chosen a different path before embarrassing the family further. Sarah was smart to find her place supporting military operations from the civilian side, my father added with paternal wisdom. Not everyone has what it takes to lead soldiers in combat. Better to contribute in ways that match your capabilities. I watched this performance with the analytical detachment I had learned to apply to enemy psychological operations. My family had constructed an elaborate narrative that preserved their sense of military superiority while explaining away my apparent failure to achieve their standards. Within this framework, I was the cautionary tale, the Mitchell child who had tried and failed to measure up to their standards. What they didn't know was that while they celebrated Mark's Bronze Star for leading a platoon through a firefight in Afghanistan, I was designing psychological operations that prevented entire regions from falling into chaos. While they praised his conventional military achievements, I was commanding operations that saved American lives through strategic deception rather than direct combat. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from General Hayes. Phoenix, urgent tasking for Joint Chiefs presentation tomorrow. National security implications. Need immediate secure communication. I glanced at the message and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had defined my adult life. Tomorrow, I would be briefing the highest levels of American military leadership on psychological operations that could reshape Middle Eastern politics. Tonight, I was listening to my family explain why I wasn't qualified for real military service. "Excuse me," I said quietly, standing from the table. "I need to take a call." "Business call during family dinner? Can't your consulting work wait until tomorrow?" "It's urgent," I replied, moving toward the hallway where I could speak privately. As I left the dining room, I heard my father's voice carrying clearly. That's the problem with civilian contractors, no understanding of proper military protocol. When your family comes first. I stepped into my father's study and activated the secure communication app on my phone. General Hayes answered immediately, her voice tight with urgency. "Phoenix, we have a developing situation in Syria. Asset Nightingale has identified a terrorist cell planning coordinated attacks on 3 American military installations. Intelligence suggests the attacks are imminent, within 72 hours. "What's the operational window?" I asked, automatically shifting into the focused mindset that had guided me through dozens of crisis situations. 12 hours for initial assessment, 24 for operational deployment. We need you to design a psychological operation that can disrupt their coordination without alerting us to our intelligence source. I looked at the door separating me from my family's celebration, thinking about Mark's promotion dinner and the careful performance of military tradition that had excluded me for 7 years. "I'll be on the first flight to Langley. Send me the intelligence briefings immediately. Phoenix, this operation has the potential to save hundreds of American lives. The President has personally authorized whatever resources you require." As I ended the encrypted call and prepared to return to my family's dinner, I realized that I was facing a choice that had been building for years. I could continue protecting my cover identity, allowing my family to believe their comfortable fiction about my failure and inadequacy, or I could finally reveal the truth about who I really was and what I had accomplished in service to our country. When I returned to the dining room, my family was deep in conversation about military leadership and the qualities that separated true warriors from support personnel. Mark was holding court with stories about combat decision-making, while my father nodded approvingly and my mother beamed with maternal pride.
"Everything all right, sweetheart?" David asked quietly as I took my seat beside him. He was the only person at the table who knew the truth about my service, the only one who understood that my consulting work involved operations at the highest levels of national security. "Work emergency," I replied. "I may need to travel tomorrow." My father overheard the exchange and looked down the table with paternal concern. "Sarah, you need to learn to set boundaries with your employers. Military families understand the importance of commitment, but civilian contractors will take advantage if you let them." "Dad's right," Mark added with brotherly wisdom. "You can't let them walk all over you just because you need the work. Show some backbone." Show some backbone. The phrase was particularly rich, coming from someone whose military service had followed conventional paths, while I operated in environments where backbone was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "I understand the importance of commitment," I said quietly. "Do you?" my father asked, his colonel's authority adding weight to the question. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you prioritize work obligations over family responsibilities. That's not how we raised you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. According to my father's logic, my dedication to classified operations that protected American lives demonstrated a character flaw, while Mark's conventional military career represented proper family values. "Maybe," my mother suggested with gentle concern, "you should consider finding work that doesn't require so much travel. David's career keeps him away enough as it is. Military families need stability." The irony was devastating. My mother was suggesting that I abandon operations that prevented terrorist attacks because my absence inconvenienced family gatherings. "I think," my Uncle James added with general's authority, "that Sarah might benefit from understanding the difference between supporting military operations and actually serving in them. There's a distinction that shouldn't be blurred." The distinction he was drawing was clear. My work was peripheral support, while real military service required the kind of courage and commitment that only uniformed personnel possessed. He had no idea that I outranked him and had been commanding operations that exceeded anything in his conventional military experience. "You're absolutely right, Uncle James," my voice carrying a calm that surprised everyone at the table. "There is an important distinction between supporting military operations and actually serving in them." I looked around the table at my family's expectant faces, these people who had spent years celebrating conventional achievements while remaining ignorant of extraordinary ones. "In fact," I continued, "I think it's time we discussed that distinction more carefully." David's hand found mine under the table, a subtle gesture of support as he recognized the shift in my tone. He knew what was coming, had been waiting for this moment for years. "Because," I said, my voice gaining strength, "some of us have been serving in ways this family has never understood." The room fell silent as they processed the implication in my words. Mark's confident expression shifted slightly, uncertainty replacing his usual assurance. "Sarah," my father said with warning in his voice, "I hope you're not about to make claims about your military service that we both know aren't accurate." "Actually, Dad, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about exactly what my military service has involved." That was the moment David stood up, his Navy SEAL training evident in the controlled power of his movement. The man my family had tolerated as my husband, the special operations warrior they had dismissed as simply adequate, was about to reveal truths that would shatter every assumption they had made about military excellence. "Before we continue this conversation," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made him effective in the world's most dangerous environments, I'd like to request permission to make a toast." My father looked annoyed at the interruption. "David, we're in the middle of a serious family discussion about Sarah's attitude toward—" "Just one toast, Colonel Mitchell," David interrupted respectfully but firmly, "in honor of someone whose service has never been properly recognized in this family." The dining room fell silent as 20 family members focused on the Navy SEAL captain who rarely spoke during our gatherings. David reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that I had never seen before. "This toast," David continued, "is in honor of my wife, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Phoenix Mitchell, whose psychological operations have prevented more terrorist attacks on American soil than anyone else in this room will ever know." The words landed like artillery shells, each syllable destroying another piece of my family's carefully constructed narrative about military hierarchy and achievement. "Lieutenant Colonel?" my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. David opened the velvet box, revealing the silver oak leaves that I had never been able to wear publicly. "Promoted to full colonel 3 months ago," he said, his voice filled with pride that my own family had never shown. "The youngest woman in U.S. military history to achieve that rank in special operations." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 20 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to dawning comprehension of how completely they had misunderstood everything. Mark was the first to find his voice, his lieutenant colonel's training kicking in as he attempted to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his understanding. "This has to be some kind of joke. Sarah, what kind of game are you and David playing here?" "It's not a game, Mark," I said quietly, accepting the oak leaves from David and pinning them to the lapel of my navy dress. The weight of the insignia felt strange after years of hiding my true rank, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The family disappointment was revealing herself to outrank everyone at the table. "But you washed out," my father said, his colonel's authority wavering as he processed information that contradicted 3 decades of carefully constructed family mythology. "You failed to complete officer candidate school. I have the documentation." David reached into his jacket again and produced a manila folder that he placed on the table with deliberate precision. "The documentation you have, Colonel Mitchell, shows Sarah's official withdrawal from OCS for personal reasons. What it doesn't show is that she was recruited directly from the program by Joint Special Operations Command for classified operations that required someone with her specific skill set." My Uncle James, whose Marine general's authority had dominated every family gathering I could remember, leaned forward with the kind of skeptical analysis that had made him effective in conventional military operations. "JSOC recruitment from OCS is virtually unheard of," he said. "They recruit from special forces, from elite units, not from training programs." "They recruited me," I said, my voice gaining strength as I finally spoke the truth that had been classified for 7 years, "because I had something they needed: fluent Arabic and Farsi, advanced psychological operations training, and an analytical mind capable of designing complex strategic deceptions." I opened the manila folder and spread its contents across the dining table, classified documents that David had somehow obtained authorization to share with my family. The papers revealed a military career that operated in the shadows, commendations for operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, fitness reports that praised tactical innovations in psychological warfare, and assignment orders for units that didn't officially exist. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Phoenix Mitchell," I continued, reading from my most recent fitness report, "Commanding Officer, Psychological Operations Task Force Phoenix, responsible for strategic deception operations across 6 combatant commands, with direct reporting to the Joint Chiefs of Staff." My mother's face had gone pale as she struggled to process information that shattered every assumption she had made about her daughter's life. "Psychological operations?" she repeated weakly. "What does that mean?" It means, David said, with the pride of a warrior recognizing excellence in a fellow professional, that while you were celebrating Mark's Bronze Star for leading a platoon through a firefight, Sarah was designing operations that prevented entire regions from falling into terrorist control. He pointed to a specific document in the folder, a presidential citation that bore security classifications I had never expected to share with civilians. This commendation is for Operation Desert Mirror, a psychological operation that turned a terrorist cell against itself and prevented coordinated attacks on 3 American military installations. Mark picked up the document with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the presidential seal and security classifications that indicated a level of operational importance he had never encountered. This says you saved hundreds of American lives. Conservatively, I replied. Operation Desert Mirror was one of 17 major psychological operations I've commanded over the past 7 years. The classified after-action reports estimate that Phoenix operations have prevented over 20 dozen terrorist attacks and disrupted recruitment networks across the Middle East. The numbers landed like physical blows, each statistic destroying another piece of my family's narrative about military hierarchy and achievement. While they had celebrated conventional military careers measured in promotions and decorations, I had been fighting a war they couldn't imagine in places that didn't exist on their maps. The consulting work, my father said slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the operational commander whose achievements exceeded anything in his own military experience. The travel, the urgent phone calls. Cover story, I confirmed. My consulting work involved designing psychological operations that required presidential authorization. The urgent phone calls were briefings to the Secretary of Defense about operations that could reshape international politics. I pulled out my military ID card, the one I had never been able to show my family, and placed it on the table next to my civilian driver's license. The contrast was stark. Civilian Sarah Mitchell Wells, unremarkable military wife, versus Colonel Sarah Mitchell, commanding officer of operations that protected American interests worldwide. The Phoenix call sign, my cousin Michael said, reading from one of the classified documents, is legendary in special operations circles. I've heard stories about Phoenix operations, but they were always classified above my pay grade. Because they were classified above everyone's pay grade, David replied. Sarah's clearance level is TS-SCI with special access programs that require individual authorization from the Director of National Intelligence. He gestured toward the documents spread across my family's dining table. Every operation Phoenix commanded required approval at levels that most military personnel will never encounter. While Mark was following conventional military career paths, Sarah was briefing the President of the United States on strategic deceptions that prevented wars. The revelation was systematic and devastating, each piece of evidence destroying another assumption my family had made about military excellence and achievement. But I could see in their faces that shock was already transforming into something more complex, the desperate need to maintain their sense of superiority despite evidence that contradicted everything they believed. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the wounded tone of someone who felt deliberately excluded from important information. "Because it was classified," I replied simply. "For 7 years, my operational security depended on maintaining a cover identity that explained my absences without revealing the nature of my actual work." "But we're family," Mark said, his lieutenant colonel's authority now seeming very small in the context of operations that exceeded his security clearance. "Trust you with what, Mark?" I asked. "The fact that while you were earning conventional decorations, I was designing operations that prevented nuclear materials from reaching terrorist cells? That while you celebrated your Bronze Star, I was commanding psychological warfare that prevented the assassination of 3 heads of state?" The questions hung in the air like artillery, each one revealing the vast gap between conventional military achievement and the strategic operations that actually shaped international security. The promotion to full colonel came after Operation Nightfall, a psychological operation that convinced a terrorist network to reveal the locations of 12 weapons caches across 3 countries. The intelligence we gathered led to raids that seized enough explosives to level downtown Washington. David stood and moved to the head of the table, positioning himself where Mark had been holding court just minutes earlier. The Joint Chiefs specifically requested Sarah's promotion because her psychological operations methodology is being integrated into strategic doctrine across combatant commands. He looked directly at my father, warrior to warrior. Colonel Mitchell, your daughter isn't just serving her country, she's revolutionizing how America fights its most important wars. The words carried the weight of absolute truth, spoken by a Navy SEAL whose own special operations experience gave him credibility my family couldn't question. But I could see in their expressions that admiration was warring with something darker, the resentment of people whose sense of superiority had been systematically demolished. "This is all very impressive," my Uncle James said finally, his Marine general's training allowing him to process tactical information even when it contradicted his expectations. "But why the deception? Why let us believe you had failed when you had actually succeeded at this level?" "Because," I replied, my voice carrying the cold precision of someone explaining operational parameters to enemy prisoners, "my cover story protected not just my operations, but the safety of every asset in the field. Your belief in my failure was a strategic necessity." I gestured around the table at my family's shocked faces. "Every family gathering where you dismissed my service, every conversation where you treated me as a disappointment, every assumption you made about my inadequacy, all of it contributed to a cover identity that kept American operations secure." The implication was devastating. My family's casual cruelty had been weaponized as part of a strategic deception that protected national security interests. "You used us," Mark said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You let us humiliate ourselves for years while you were secretly laughing at our ignorance." I wasn't laughing. I was serving my country in ways that required personal sacrifices you've never had to make. My phone buzzed with another encrypted message from General Hayes. "Phoenix, Syrian operation approved at presidential level. Transport departing Langley in 6 hours. National security priority 1. I glanced at the message and stood from the table, the weight of immediate operational responsibility overwhelming any concern for my family's emotional processing of classified revelations. "I need to leave," I announced. "There's a developing situation that requires immediate attention." "Leave?" my mother said, her voice rising with the kind of maternal authority that had controlled family dynamics for decades. "Sarah, we're in the middle of a serious family discussion. You can't just walk away." "Actually, Mom," I replied, pinning my classified military ID to my dress next to the Colonel's oak leaves, "I can, because while you were planning Mark's promotion celebration, I was designing operations that prevent American cities from being destroyed by terrorist attacks." I looked around the table one final time at these people who had spent years celebrating conventional achievements while remaining ignorant of extraordinary ones. The urgent phone call I received tonight was notification of a terrorist cell planning coordinated attacks on 3 American military installations. In 6 hours, I'll be on a plane to Syria to implement psychological operations that could save hundreds of American lives. The silence that followed was absolute, the weight of real-world consequences silencing any further discussion of family dynamics and hurt feelings. "But your brother's celebration," my father said weakly, his colonel's authority completely deflated by the revelation that his daughter outranked him and operated at levels he couldn't comprehend. "Mark's promotion to lieutenant colonel is an admirable achievement," I replied, my voice carrying the professional respect one officer showed another, "but it doesn't take precedence over operations that prevent mass casualties on American soil." David stood and moved to my side, his Navy SEAL training evident in the way he automatically shifted into operational mode. "You're leaving," he said, his voice carrying the calm efficiency of someone preparing for deployment. Wait, Mark said, rising from his chair with desperate urgency. Sarah, we need to talk about this. We need to understand what this means for our family. I stopped at the dining room door and turned to face my brother, this man who had spent years positioning himself as the superior military officer in our family. What it means, Mark, is that for 7 years you've been celebrating conventional military achievements while your sister was commanding operations that actually matter. I gestured toward the classified documents still spread across our family's dining table. Every assumption you've made about military hierarchy, every comparison you've drawn between my service and mine, every time you've dismissed my work as inadequate, all of it was based on information you didn't have clearance to access. The words landed with surgical precision, cutting through years of family mythology with the efficiency of a strategic weapon. The daughter you treated as a failure has been briefing the president on operations that reshape international security. The sister you dismissed as inadequate outranks everyone at this table and commands psychological operations that prevent wars. I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me but had never really known me. For 31 years, you've measured military excellence by conventional standards, promotions, decorations, public recognition, but the most important wars are fought in shadows by people whose names never appear in newspapers. My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what she had failed to understand about her own daughter. Sarah, we're so sorry. We didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. You constructed a narrative about my failure because it was easier than questioning your assumptions about what military service actually means. I pulled my car keys from my purse and headed toward the door, the weight of immediate operational responsibility overwhelming any remaining connection to family drama. Colonel Mitchell, my father called out, using my rank for the first time in his life. Will we see you again after this operation? I paused in the doorway, considering the question with the analytical precision I applied to strategic planning. It depends, I said finally, on whether you're interested in knowing who I actually am, or whether you prefer the comfortable fiction you've maintained for 7 years. David and I left them sitting in stunned silence around their dining table, surrounded by classified documents that revealed a truth they never had been equipped to understand. As we drove through the Norfolk night toward Langley Air Force Base, I felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling around my shoulders like armor. How do you feel? David asked as we merged onto the interstate that would take us to the most important briefing of my career. Free, I replied, and realized it was true. For 7 years, I had protected my family's ignorance at the cost of my own recognition. Tonight, I had finally chosen operational truth over personal comfort. My phone rang with another encrypted message from General Hayes. Phoenix, Syrian operation has expanded in scope. We're looking at potential coordinated attacks across multiple theaters. Understood, I replied, shifting into the focused mindset that had guided me through dozens of crisis situations. What's the operational timeline? Immediate deployment, indefinite duration. This could be the most significant psychological operation of your career. I looked out the car window at the Virginia landscape rushing past, thinking about my family's shocked faces and their desperate attempts to process information that contradicted everything they believed about military excellence. General, I said, I'm ready. 6 months later, I was standing in the Oval Office, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for psychological operations that prevented what intelligence analysts called the most significant terrorist threat to American interests since 9/11. The Syrian operation had evolved into a multinational strategic deception that dismantled terrorist networks across 3 continents. The president himself presented the medal, shaking my hand with the respect reserved for Americans who had served their country beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. Colonel Mitchell, he said, your service represents the highest traditions of American military excellence. The operations you commanded saved countless lives and protected interests vital to national security. The ceremony was classified, attended only by officials with the highest security clearances. My family would never see the medal, never read about the operations, never understand the full scope of what I had accomplished in their absence.
But that no longer mattered.
I had finally stopped seeking approval from people who measured excellence by standards too limited to recognize true achievement. 2 weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from my father, delivered through military channels to my classified address at the Pentagon. "Dear Colonel Mitchell," it began, using my rank rather than my name. "I've spent 6 months trying to understand what you revealed to our family that night. I've read every unclassified document I could find about psychological operations, spoken with colleagues who have clearance to discuss your work in general terms, and struggled to reconcile the daughter I thought I knew with the officer whose achievements exceed anything in my own military experience." The letter continued for 3 pages, a career military officer's attempt to process the revelation that his daughter had surpassed him in ways he couldn't comprehend. "I want you to know," he concluded, "that I am proud of your service, even if I don't understand it. More importantly, I am ashamed of the years we spent diminishing achievements we didn't have clearance to recognize. You have served your country with distinction, and I should have trusted that truth even when I couldn't see the evidence." I read the letter twice, then filed it away in the same secure cabinet where I kept classified operational briefings. It was an apology, but it came too late to matter. The war for my family's respect was over, but I had already moved on to battles that actually counted. 3 years later, I was promoted to Brigadier General, the youngest woman in U.S. military history to achieve flag rank in special operations. The promotion ceremony was held at the Pentagon, attended by the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. My family was not invited because they still didn't have clearance to attend classified ceremonies. But David was there, resplendent in his dress uniform, watching with pride as I accepted responsibilities that would shape American strategic operations for decades to come. After the ceremony, a reporter from a military publication approached me for an interview about breaking barriers for women in special operations. "General Mitchell," she said, "what advice would you give to young women who aspire to serve at the highest levels of military leadership?" I thought about my family's dining room, about years of being dismissed as inadequate, about the choice between seeking approval and serving with excellence. "My advice," I said, "is to remember that the most important battles are often fought in silence by people whose names never appear in history books. True service means choosing duty over recognition, mission over comfort, and excellence over approval." The interview was published in a magazine my family would never read, discussing operations they would never understand, celebrating achievements they would never be cleared to acknowledge. And that was exactly how it should be. Some victories are too important to share with people who measure success by standards too small to matter. I was Brigadier General Sarah Phoenix Mitchell, and I had finally learned that the only approval worth seeking comes from people who understand what excellence actually costs. The war was over, the mission continued, and that was enough. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who should be supporting you. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, if you've ever achieved something extraordinary that went unrecognized, if you've ever had to choose between seeking approval and serving something greater than yourself, share your story below. In this community, we honor the quiet heroes who serve in shadows and measure success by impact, not recognition.